2.4 million. It's just about the combined population of Maine and New Hampshire. 2.4 million also happens to be the number of inmates in American prisons and jails. And many of those people are not dangerous criminals. They've been trapped by addiction since early childhood and then trapped behind bars as soon as they become adults. But it's all okay, right? Because we're winning the war on drugs. Hardly. I want to talk to you about 3 of those stories today, and let's start with Tracy. Tracy is a 26-year-old woman whose story can be used to combine the sad history of many users. She became addicted to narcotic painkillers when she was injured in a car accident. And then she turned to heroin. It was cheaper and easier to find. And then she started to commit crime to support her addiction. And she amassed a criminal record: possession of heroin, forgery, theft, credit card fraud. She spent time in jail, time in prison, time on probation. She received treatment and she struggled there without a whole lot of success. Nothing seemed to work. She had her daughter taken from her by the state. She lost her job. She became homeless. An offender with a very similar history hit rock bottom one night when she was using with her boyfriend. He overdosed. She called 911. But her addiction was so powerful that before the police arrived, she took the needle out of his arm and she finished the heroin herself. More than 7 out of 10 inmates suffer from an addiction, yet they're incarcerated. Why? Because for decades, we have exalted incarceration over every other criminal justice response. But we know from the empirical studies that prison does not change behavior. It does not defeat addiction. In fact, it cultivates addiction, and it helps turn offenders into more effective criminals. But what if there were an approach that addressed the underlying causes of crime and not just the crime itself? An approach that assessed the nature of an offender's background and the severity of their addiction and offered a solution. An approach proven to work with the empirical data to back it up. An approach that dramatically improves lives while at the same time significantly reducing crime and saving a whole lot of taxpayer money in the process. There is. It's called drug court. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. But before I get there, we need to take a look at what a Superior Court judge faces every day under the traditional model of crime and punishment. So let's talk about David. David is a high school graduate, and he became addicted to non-prescribed opiates when he was 18. He then escalated to heavy doses of heroin every day, and he was an alcoholic. He was raised by his mother, who also abused opiates, and she died unexpectedly at age 47. He had one brother who spent time in federal prison for robbery. Yes, you guessed it. He was an addict too. And David's journey through the criminal justice system started when he was arrested for possession of heroin. And he was given a suspended sentence and 2 years of probation. But under regular probation, he was predictably drug tested every other Wednesday. So you can imagine, David was pretty streetwise, and he simply learned to time his use around that test. He received no treatment. His addiction continued. He violated probation not once, not twice, but 4 times. And after each violation, his sentence increased, and after each release, his addiction continued. Until finally, he was arrested for felony burglary at age 25, and then he headed to state prison for 3 years. And I asked myself, as a Superior Court judge, how can I sit in the courtroom every day and send someone like David to jail over and over again, knowing that it doesn't work? There's no question. Dangerous offenders, drug traffickers, they belong in prison. But prison just wasn't working for people with an addiction. And I saw firsthand the same offenders going back to prison again and again, each time with an increase in their sentence and each time without a change in their behavior or addiction. And I felt certain that by using and creating drug courts, we'd be more likely to reduce crime and help offenders return to the community as contributing members. Of 100 inmates leaving prison after spending 1 year at a cost of $30,000 each, 70 will reoffend. Of 100 graduates from drug court at a cost of $8,000 a year, only 22 will reoffend. So the choice seems clear to me. And why are drug courts so successful? I think it's for 3 reasons: rigor, accountability, and a team approach. Drug court participants are given a suspended sentence, and they're required to attend treatment 3 hours a day, 3 days a week. They go to self-help meetings every single day, and they are random drug tested twice a week, and their probation officer can show up any time of the day or night. And then later in the program, they're actually required to get a GED or get a job. They come back to court every week to tell the judge how they're doing. So this is them coming back to court and talking to the judges. And so what we need to do is take a look at David. Let's go back to his situation and what would happen to him under a traditional model of sentencing. His defense attorney would ask for no prison time, and the prosecutor would ask for a lengthy prison sentence, and then the probation report would recommend some sort of confinement in between. And that's not an untypical scene. But for Tracy, who was sentenced to drug court, the same judge, the same prosecutor, the same defense attorney, the same treatment provider, the same case manager and probation officer, they all functioned as a drug court team. And the team would meet weekly at the courthouse to assess Tracy's progress and the progress of the other offenders in the program. And the team would decide together, should someone get an incentive for doing well that week, or should they get a sanction for failing to comply? And obviously, each of us on the team, we had to really change our old ways of thinking. We had to try to see things as other members of the team might see them. And really, it was not always easy. There was a time when we actually argued at a training over whether we should be calling drug tests positive or dirty. But in the process, we built respect and tolerance for each other, and we began to treat the offenders with compassion. So after every team meeting, the offender appears in the courtroom, and the judge calls each one up individually to ask about how they're doing. Have they appeared on time for treatment and fully participated? Did they go to their meetings and contribute? Did they test negative for drugs or alcohol? You know, before I became a drug court judge, I didn't really talk with the offenders. And now I ask them, how's your job going? How's your daughter doing? I hear you're struggling in treatment. Tell me about that. Studies actually show that the rate of reoffending is significantly reduced when a judge spends 3 minutes every week just talking with the offenders. So what happens if somebody relapses? If they're honest about their use, then the team adjusts treatment and finds ways to provide more support. But if they're dishonest about their use, or they don't go to treatment as they're required to do without a good reason, then the team will use sanctions to address non-compliant behavior, rather than simply imposing their fully suspended sentence after the first mistake. So I have to stop here and talk to you a little bit about honesty. To you and me, that seems pretty simple, but I'm always surprised about how difficult it is for offenders to be honest. And we tell them, show up and be honest. We had a team meeting one time, and John said to me, I think we're going to have to sanction one of the offenders today. John was the probation officer, and I said, okay, what's up? I figured he had a positive urine test. And he said, no, his test was negative. And I said, okay, well, what happened? And he said, well, we found this on him. And he pulled out a Whizzinator. Has anybody heard of a Whizzinator? Good. Okay, well, maybe there's one hand back there. I'm not going to ask you why you know. A Whizzinator happens to be an easy-to-conceal urinating device used to deliver a drug-free sample. And it looks remarkably real. I'm not going to show you a slide. It's strapped on before an offender shows up for a drug test. It's really hard to imagine, isn't it? But it's an example of how far an offender's addiction will take them. Obviously, someone who used that technique would get a pretty stiff sanction in drug court that week. But contrary to common belief, lengthy, severe punishment does not change behavior. What does are moderate, immediate, and certain sanctions. And sanctions in drug court can be anything from writing an essay about honesty to completing community service or showing up and spending a day in court or spending several days in jail. But we don't just use sanctions in drug court. Studies have shown for this group of offenders, rewarding the behavior we want to see repeated is more effective than sanctioning the behavior we're trying to discourage. You all know that from raising your kids, right? So when someone does well in drug court, they get an incentive, and it can be something as simple as praise from the judge, or applause from the team, or it can be something more meaningful like a gas card or a gift card to a grocery store. Most of these offenders have never received this kind of positive feedback in their lives. In fact, one offender, after getting applause for doing well, he was 28 years old, he said to me, "Judge, this is the first time since I was 11 that I wasn't drunk or high on my birthday." So In the 1980s, we used boot camps and scare tactics to threaten offenders into compliance. And we told them, one mistake on probation and your entire sentence is going to be imposed. So it's no surprise now that we know from studies those techniques did nothing to improve outcomes and really, in most cases, made matters worse. We all know a firmly ingrained habit is very difficult to break simply by will alone. So after the boot camps didn't work, we tried treatment inside the jails. It sounds good at first blush. Treat the offender, keep them off the streets. But I have confidence in the studies that now show that treatment behind the walls without intensive, rigorous, continual follow-up in the community has minimal impact on behavior. And that's because when they're in prison, offenders are separated from family and friends. They might lose their job or their home. They don't have to face the normal life challenges that might trigger a relapse. Prison is highly regulated. Prisoners are told when to get up, when to eat, when to shower, when to sleep. They don't have to figure out what to do when an old friend comes knocking on the door trying to sell them drugs. They don't have to figure out how to deal with family conflict or the loss of a job. Studies show that for this group of offenders, providing treatment and requiring accountability works. So in drug court, offenders have the ability to practice the tools they learn in treatment out in the community and then account for their conduct in court. Most of our treatment and sentencing models, though, are hindered by an age-old belief that's now disproved by science, that abstinence is the only way to treat a heroin addiction, that those who use heroin are just weak. But I'll tell you, it does not take much to become addicted to heroin. One hit can do it. Once the heroin enters the body, it literally begins to rewire the brain, damaging neuroreceptors, and then reinforcing the craving and the need for the drug. And then soon, that overwhelming pain of withdrawal negatively reinforces the addiction, and the cycle just keeps going. We were at a drug court training a couple years ago, and they showed us the MRI of an Alzheimer's patient's brain, and then the MRI of a cocaine addict's brain, and they looked remarkably similar. Just say no? No way. Researchers have found that only 1 in 10 opiate addicts can stop using without medical assistance and with just treatment. 1 in 10. The other 9 require medical assistance in addition to treatment to become and stay sober. And as one author has just put it so well, it's an unfortunate irony of our criminal justice system that getting locked up for a heroin overdose is easier than getting a prescription for Suboxone to prevent one. So let's go back to Tracy. She graduated from drug court in February, and she's been sober for 2 years. And she has her daughter back. She's now working to be a recovery coach, and she mentors newcomers to drug court. But it wasn't always easy. As many of the offenders do, she struggled to follow the rules. She resisted treatment. She had relapses. But eventually she realized that she could have a better life if she invested in the program. And so she began to trust the team and the motivation of its members. And here's Paul on his graduation day with his beautiful 4-year-old granddaughter. When Paul was 5, his father would take him on drug runs. Imagine, 5 years old, driving around in a car while your father sold drugs. What chance did he have? He and his mother left, but then the stepfather entered the picture, and he was an abusive alcoholic. And soon after that family dysfunction, Paul started using alcohol and pot when he was 9. When he was 13, he started using cocaine. By the time he was 15, he was selling and using cocaine daily. His parents left the state, and Paul stayed behind, living out of a car, selling drugs till he was 18. Somehow he managed to get a job at a welding company, but as you can imagine, it did not last long because he was still using. He had 4 children with 3 different women. He spent his early 20s using heroin and spending time in prison. He overdosed 8 times. He literally spent 30 of his 45 years using drugs. And then finally, some pretty serious charges landed him in drug court. And Paul openly admits, I took that drug court deal as a ticket out of jail. He had no intention of complying with the program rules. But something changed as he began to work his way through those obligations of drug court. He actually began to regain the respect of his children and his family and his friends. And he began to enjoy the feeling of being sober. He finally fully engaged in treatment, and he wasn't using drugs for the first time in his life. And now he works as a crew member on a painting company. And he also volunteers at a homeless shelter. And he has stable housing. At his graduation, with his own daughter present, he said, "I was never a good father. And now I have a chance to be a good grandfather." His best friend, who spoke on his behalf, she said, "The only time I ever thought I'd be making a tribute to Paul would have been at his funeral." There are countless success stories like Tracy's and Paul's, and though not everyone makes it through drug court for sure, I have yet to meet a participant who doesn't want to be and stay sober. They want to be good parents to their kids. They want full, productive lives, and I believe drug court gives them the best chance to make that possible. There is good in most people, and sometimes it becomes buried by a life of despair and then numbed by the tragic effects of addiction. But we can help those afflicted with humanity and compassion. So what can you do? You could contact your state and local officials. Get the message out that drug courts are not soft on crime, they're effective on crime, that spending dollars up front is going to save dollars down the line. Maybe you can volunteer a skill you have to make the drug court programs work better. You should support sentences that offer treatment instead of jail to those who need help. We can seek justice without treatment, and we can seek treatment without justice. But the evidence, the science, tell us drug courts give us the opportunity to do both. Thank you.